Well, federal leaders are campaigning on their promise to address Canada's housing crisis, pitching their plans as the best to build more homes.
We will build homes you can afford to buy, homes that are more sustainable and cost less to live in.
We will axe the sales tax on new homes and incentivize municipalities to cut their development taxes to bring down housing costs by $100,000.
Okay, so here's what the Liberals are pledging in this election. They aim to build 500,000 homes a year, eliminate the GST for first-time homebuyers on homes under $1 million, and provide $25 billion in financing for prefabricated home builders. Meanwhile, the Conservatives say they'll build 2.3 million homes in 5 years, eliminate the GST for first-time homebuyers on homes under $1.3 million, and tie federal infrastructure funding for municipalities to results. So what will it take to follow through on these platform promises? Here with me is Ian Underwood, CEO of Habitat for Humanity for the Greater Toronto Area, and Mike Moffat, who is the Senior Director of Policy and Innovation at the Smart Prosperity Institute. It's good to see you both. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
Ian, let's start with you.
Thanks for having us.
Plans to accelerate, construction, reduce red tape, reduce development costs, 500,000, hundreds of homes a year. I mean, are these realistic pitches? How do you view them?
Well, it's election time, so lots of promises are being made. But, the place I think I want to start is what's really encouraging with what we're hearing from both the leading parties is the emphasis on government fees and taxes.
Right.
I look back on the last few elections. We didn't talk about government fees and taxes before, but I'm sitting here as a home builder. I'm one of 45 habitats across Canada. These are very real to us as a nonprofit builder. They're real to the for-profit builders. And so the fact that government are talking the leaders are talking so much about fees and taxes, and the two biggest ones, which are the GST and the development charges,
right.
That is encouraging. And I can tell you, for us at Habitat for Humanity, all of us across Canada, that will make a difference.
Okay, I just want to ask you quickly about development fees and how they got so high. Because I remember my first job was covering city council back in St. John's, and every year when the budget would come up, they didn't want to raise the property tax because it's kind of a blunt instrument. People on fixed incomes can see the value of their house rise, and they can't really afford to pay it. So you start raising development fees to compensate, so people get priced out of the entry to the market because they don't want to hurt the people already in there. That's kind of the trend.
Kind of, or I think put another way is, across the board, both with the GST, the HST on homes, the development charges, all of the fees. Canadian Centre for Economic Analysis estimated that in Ontario, they're now as much as 36% of a new home.
Yeah, that's
so
before you even
your
build,
question
right?
is why? Well, it was easier. It's less vote sensitive historically to just keep raising fees than say we're raising your property taxes. The problem is now we have an entire generation, multiple generations coming after them who cannot afford a place to live. If they cannot afford a place to live, they can't be productive and they might not even stay.
Right.
So it's really good that we're now saying we got to fix this for the next generation.
So Mike, do these plans fix this for the next generation? Do they make a dent in that? What's your sense?
Yeah, I definitely think they're going to make a dent in it. I don't think these plans to hit 500,000 homes a year, that target is particularly realistic. We've never done more than 300,000 a year in the history of Canada, and it's going to take time. You look at the Liberal plan to incentivize more factory-built housing. I think that's a great idea, but let alone, building a home overnight, you certainly can't build a factory overnight. So I think, we're going to have to understand that this is going to take some time. And I do worry that both Liberals and Conservatives are giving people a little bit of false hope about how quickly we're going to be able to pull those off.
So when you look at what's there, what would you say is the biggest strength and the most promising policy proposals that are on the table? It seems like a lot of builders are like, thank God for the GST promise from both of the major parties. That's something they think will make units viable, perhaps. How do you view it, Mike?
Yeah, I think the Conservative GST promise is particularly strong. It applies to homes that are up to 1.3 million, and it applies to anybody who buys a home. Because the GST only applies to new housing, it basically acts like a construction tax, the same way a development charge does. So I think that's a helpful policy. I think on the Liberal side, they are reintroducing a tax credit from the 1970s called the MERB program, which gives investors in kind of small-scale apartments incentives to build new apartment buildings. It worked back then. I think it would work again today. So I do think that the tax portions of both of these platforms are really strong. The conservative side's a little bit stronger on the ownership side, whereas the liberals are a little bit stronger on the rental side.
Okay, so Ian, how do you see the promises on getting these development fees down, right? There are some incentives there to do it from the Liberals. The Conservatives in the past have basically more of a stick approach on infrastructure money for municipalities that don't hit percentage targets. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think regardless of which party ends up leading the government, both of those promises will take some fine tuning. Because the Conservatives have said they'll match 50 cents on the dollar for every reduction. The Liberals have said they'll drop them by 50%, but they'll do that by, if I understand it, streaming in other funding for infrastructure. So it leads to another thing that's actually in these plans. They've both acknowledged they have to be more careful about the bureaucracy they create when they're trying to help.
Sure.
And so that's going to be a nuance on both of them of how they get at it.
So Mike, when you look at the Conservative plan, they reward cities that permit more than 15% more homes a year, reduces infrastructure funding for cities who miss their targets. Well, what do you make of that carrot and stick approach here?
Yeah, well, I think it's been a little bit mischaracterized. You know, the liberals are saying, like, do what we say and we'll give you a cookie. And the conservatives are saying, well, if you don't do what we say, we won't give you a cookie. But at the end of the day, it's money for cookies. There's not that much difference between the two. I do think the conservatives will have to go back to the drawing board a little bit. You know, that 15% is a blunt instrument. It kind of rewards cities that haven't been building all that much housing. But it is interesting that the Conservatives are talking about eliminating the housing accelerator, but then they have all these municipal promises, funding promises that basically look like the housing accelerator. So, you know, there's a lot of theater in the debate about how different these policies are. But when you start to dig through the details, I actually think these platforms are more alike than they are different.
Right.
Yeah.
The 15% target, year over year over year, having to hit that, you could just hit building capacity with your labor force, with your population. That's a tough one.
There's a lot of easier said than done on that. But I think what we're seeing, so what's interesting here is the public looks to the federal government as being the most to blame for the housing challenge. The difficulty is all three levels of government have a hand in it, and the municipality has the biggest say on what actually gets built. So what you're seeing with the federal government is attempts to, you know, how do they kind of leverage their way into it? And I think we will continue to see more trial and error. Again, what I think is commendable with both of the, you know, the platforms we've been talking about is they are using the levers that are most available to the federal government, which is the taxation policy. And what Mike was just getting at with the MERB is the how do you incentivize private capital into building the housing that we need? The Conservatives have a version of that too. They've talked about if you sell an asset and you reinvest that asset in Canada, then the capital gains would be relieved from it. So they're on the right track. That will need some fine tuning to make sure that reinvestment gets to the right place and doesn't just create more of what neither of them have talked about, which is this financialization of housing.
Right.
And then, you know, continuing to challenge the affordability for everyone.
Okay, so Mike, just on this point, like on Monday, either, you know, Mark Carney gets to continue or there's a change, you know, but the municipal governments across Canada, they're not on the ballot on Monday. The provincial governments across Canada, they're not on the ballot on Monday. And that's where a lot of the control, like they cannot open up zoning regulations in the city of Toronto or the city of Ottawa or in Fredericton at the federal level. So, I mean, how much should Canadians expect things to change just because the federal government is coming to the table with a series of policies when really it's provinces and cities that control a lot of the real important decisions here?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And again, it's part of my concern with some of these targets that there's so much out of the control of the federal government because there's so many bottlenecks. You look at, you know, a lack of land. You know, ultimately, it's the province and municipalities who do things like set urban growth boundaries. If we do start to scale up housing, you know, you wonder where you're going to get the electricians and the roofers and the plumbers from, and that's largely provincial policy. So absolutely, like the federal government does have a number of policy levers, but this is, you know, it's almost like a fleet of ships, right? You tend to move at the rate of the slowest ship. And, you know, if the provinces and municipalities aren't going to play ball, then not much is going to get done.
Right, so the premiers, Ian, and the mayors and the councillors, they need to do a little bit more lifting in a lot of cases here too, right?
Unquestionably. What is encouraging is, I think probably across Canada, there hasn't been a municipal election or a provincial election in the last 2 years where housing hasn't been in the top 3.
Right.
So the good news is every level of government is motivated around this. Every politician is more familiar, more aware of the levers they will need to pull. In many respects, the hard part is getting at my generation, the generation that has done well, and is helping us understand we need to give up some of our privilege. Some of that relates to zoning, some of that relates to capital gains, dare I say it, in order for our children and grandchildren to do better. And it goes back to what Mike said. This will not be an overnight fix to a problem we have in Canada that was decades in the making. But it's encouraging. You know, a year and a half ago, we thought this would be a housing election. Then we thought it'd be a housing and affordability election. Then we thought housing wouldn't get talked about at all. So we're thrilled that it is coming back and that people are paying attention and talking about it.
Yeah, look, a lot of older homeowners want young people to be able to afford a home, just not their home. They want to keep their value up. That's one of the tensions in solving
That
this whole
is the
problem.
tension.
All right, look, I want to thank you both for your analysis on this. Ian Underwood and Mike Moffat. Always appreciate the time. Thank you both.
Thank you.